Song called "Oblivious" by the group Anna of the North from their album that's listening here, Rising Suns from their album Oblivious. Uh, you are listening to WOJD 88.9 FM, and we're going to be talking about Treaty Day right now. We have Mr. Rick SaintGermain in the studio. Good morning, sir.
Morning.
How are you?
Great.
Boys are doing well.
Yes.
I like the medallion that Mark made for me. It was very, very nice of them, and they're kind of busy doing silversmithing, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
Yeah. All right. Well, talk to us about what Treaty Day is about and its significance to the tribes here in northern Wisconsin and LCO.
Mark, in January of every year, we celebrate or recognize this Treaty Day because of its significance in the lives of the Ojibwe people from northern Wisconsin and northern Michigan and parts of Minnesota. Uh, it's a big factor in our lives because we litigated the issue of treaty rights going way back into the early 1970s and 80s, and eventually these cases ended up in the Supreme Court in the 1980s and the 1990s. So it's a big part of our life. It has a lot to do with preserving our heritage, our culture, our way of life, and promises that were made in treaties going way back into the early 1830s for us, and some of our neighboring tribes way back to the 1700s. It's a long story, Mark.
Yeah, it is. I've actually posted on our Facebook page um, uh, an article from, well, I forgot where it's from now. Oh my goodness. But they published a treaty calendar for the Northern Lakes region. And then, like you said, it goes back to the 1700s. They even list the first date on this is 1620. And then it shows you the timeline of all the trees in the land, and again, mostly in the northern Great Lakes area for Ojibwe.
Well, if you look in the dictionary, you'll see that a treaty is a formally conducted, negotiated, and ratified agreement between nations. Now, it specifies nations. And by the way, um, that um, that definition of treaty fell into the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's one of the reasons why tribes are considered quasi-sovereign nations
Mm,
today, because the
hmm.
United States negotiated over 370 some treaties with individual tribal nations.
Sure. Wow. And yeah, and I think those are listed here. Oh, I just had the site too for here it is. Featured nations in this article is Bad River, LCO, Lac de Flambeau, Red Cliff, um, Mole Lake, and I think that covers no St. Croix. Did I miss any?
Mole Lake, you got Mole Lake,
Yeah.
Red Cliff, and
Yep.
yeah, sure.
And again, this article that I had, excuse me, posted was from Wisconsin First Nations article, and they have some education resources on their website at the wisconsinfirstnations.org, or you can go to our Facebook page, and I posted the link onto there. So, what was some of the decisions? Talk about this LCO versus Voight decision. Um, how is that involved in this?
I don't really want to talk about that yet. I want to
Okay,
tell you a little bit of background
okay,
to get us to the Voight decision.
all right,
So, to the background, we have to go way back to the United States when it was created and formed after the Revolutionary War.
hmm,
The United States became a nation. And in doing so, it already had some property that it had taken from tribes along the Atlantic seacoast. And as a new nation, thousands of people were pouring in from mostly from Europe, and there were slaves coming into the southern regions of the Caribbeans, and the slaves were being used for labor
Mm.
in southern plantations and farms, and there was an industry of sorts in the United States, believe it or not, way back in the 1770s and 80s, was a growing economy. There were riches to be found beyond the Appalachian Mountains into the West.
Mm.
When the United States became a nation, of course, it formed a government, and the Continental Congress uh, was aware of all of the riches of land, the pine timber, the minerals that were held west of the Appalachian Mountains. And not only this, get this. England had negotiated the Treaty of Paris in 1783 with the new nation.
Mm.
The United States was brand new,
Yeah.
and so reluctantly, the Great Britain decided, gee, I guess they beat us,
Mm.
so
Wow.
we have to pay them something. And one of the things we're going to pay them is we're going to give them some property. We're going to give them the Big Ten states.
Mm.
What are the Big Ten
Yeah.
states?
What's that?
Well, that's Ohio State. It's Indiana. You got Michigan, Illinois. You have parts of Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
You have what would become Wisconsin, and even a little piece of Minnesota. So
Yeah.
those were the Big Ten states. Only back then, in 1787, what they referred to the Big Ten states was the Northwest Territory.
Okay.
Why? Because it was located northwest of New York, which was
Yeah.
pretty much the capital back then.
Hmm.
So the United States garnered this huge tract of land, the Big Ten states. And what did they do? They notified these incoming immigrants that there was land to be had. Of course, they had to go through a process to receive the land. They
Hmm.
had to get these land grants
Yeah.
from the United States, not from Indians or anybody else. So the settlers poured in across the Appalachian Mountains. They poured in across Tennessee and South Carolina, the Carolinas and Florida. They just poured into the interior of the land. And
Mm.
what happened? There were thousands of Indians living in these regions. So let's just look at Ohio. Prior to 1798, there were 10,000 immigrants living in Ohio. Now get
Wow.
this,
Yeah.
a dozen years later, that 10,000 grew to 230,000.
Mm.
Practically overnight, you have
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of immigrants pouring across the Appalachians into this rich farmland. But there were Algonquian Indians living there, like the Miami and the Mascoutin and Delaware, and just a host of tribes. But most importantly, the Shawnee Indians, some of the Illinois Indians. These were all Algonquians. Believe it or not, these tribal people that lived there spoke an Algonquian language, which is Ojibwe.
Mm.
So they were relatives of the Ojibwe people.
Mm.
And they were displaced. They were just pushed over to the west into Indiana. And what happened was the United States saw these battles going on, ferocious battles, people getting killed back and forth. They came in with a series of about a dozen treaties, and in those treaties, what was used was a new instrument called cession.
Mm.
It's a way a government acquires land from another people. It's cession is a fancy word for theft. It's a granting of land in exchange for other uh, goods. And so, what the United States did was conduct a series of cession treaties. They started with Ohio and took the Ohio lands. You had the Treaty of Grenville of 1795, Treaty of Fort Stanwix, Treaty of Fort McIntosh, Treaty of Great Miami, Fort Harmer, on and on and on. And the tribes that were removed were the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Seneca, the Miami. All of these tribes got pushed out, and the whole notion of cession treaty was born.
Wow.
And cession treaty is nothing more than a thieving treaty
Yeah.
in which white people move in by force with military and armament and blast the Indians out, and then sign a treaty with anybody that they select to be the headman, to chiefs
Mm-hmm.
to sign for those treaties. And it was usually the remnants of the Indians who were left behind when the others were pushed out. So that's what happened in Ohio. And then next came Indiana, and you had the same thing happen.
Yeah.
And then Michigan, and then Illinois. And what was the big prize? The big prize was northern Wisconsin. So that's kind of a long about way of telling you a little bit of the history of how the United States acquired the lands in the Big Ten states, the Northwest Territory.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, the United States created what was known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And the Continental Congress created a set of rules, a set of principles for dealing with the Indians in the West. And I can quote some of that Northwest Ordinance, but basically they said, of utmost good faith shall always be shown to the Indians. We shall never take their lands without just compensation. And so they were setting the rules of how to deal with the Indians, but on the other hand, the military and the settlers were just pouring in and declaring war on these tribes and just wiping them out. And then, of course, what prevailed after that was the Removal Act of 1830, in which whole numbers of tribes were displaced and pushed into the Indian Territory, which would become the state of Oklahoma. You know, we have relatives that live in Oklahoma today. Some of our relatives, by the way, we've got a lady that's teaching in our school over here. She's teaching Ojibwe language, and
Yeah.
she grew up and was raised in Oklahoma. That's Indian Territory. And what was she doing in Oklahoma? Well, she's a Potawatomi, and she got pushed out of her tribe got pushed out of Illinois and pushed into Indian Territory, which became um, Oklahoma. So here just think of it, how these tribes who spoke our language, and now here we go, a couple hundred years later, we've got this gal teaching in our school.
Yeah. Wow. We're talking with Rick SaintGermain, a Le Coudray member here and historian, and the knowledge that you have in your head, it's amazing because we've talked about other historical events, and right now we're talking about Treaty Day and the significance of that for the Ojibwe tribes in northwest or northern Wisconsin. Go ahead and
Mark,
continue.
how did I learn this stuff? I learned it kind of by accident. I was elected to the tribal governing board in 1975. I was pretty young back then, and I was a brand new teacher, but I was on the governing board, and what did I find? I found that the tribe was in the midst of a big court case, and actually, we were in the midst of 3 big court cases, and we lost one of those. And then we lost this one in 1978, and it was a court case involving the tribe's right to hunt and fish and gather
Mhm.
in the ceded territory. And when we say ceded territory, now again, that becomes a part of that word cession, to grant property or land from the property that you own to another nation in exchange for goods and whatever.
Mm.
So we ceded the land to the United States, and in exchange, they offered us land over in western Minnesota to get us out of Wisconsin.
Mm.
Wisconsin was, rich in timber. There just
Yeah.
wasn't anything like it
Yeah.
beyond the Missouri River. And so we had all of these hundreds of thousands and millions of people pouring into the West, and they were building cities all over the place in Chicago and in Ohio and Illinois, like St. Louis, Missouri, for example, right on the border with Illinois. Hundreds of thousands of people, and they needed homes. And what did they have? They had hardwood, so they had to get pine timber. And where was the pine timber? The greatest pine timber stand was located up here in northern Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So the United States wanted our timber. And and so when I was on the tribal council in 1975, we had just undertaken a court case, and that case was um, was the Tribble brothers who were arrested and fined for fishing
Yeah.
off the reservation.
Mhm.
And they argued that, according to the Treaty of 1837, we had the right to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territory off of our reservation.
Yeah.
And so we litigated that case into the federal court in Madison. And in 1978, we lost. But how did I learn it? I was going to some of the hearings, and
Mm.
I was sitting there. I was so fascinated. We had lawyers, we had university professors from Michigan State University, and we had John Clifford, who was an eminent professor well, eventually he ended up at UW Green Bay, and Jim McClurkin. We had just these unbelievably bright historians who were really teaching me an education about LCO history. And what did I do? I took a trip to Washington and spent 2 weeks in the National Archives, and I just dug through tons of material.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
would I would open up the National Archives at 8 o'clock in the morning, and
Wow.
I would stay there till they kicked me out at 10:30 at night, and I was just, you know,
Mm.
reading and reading and reading. I wanted to know all about our court case, so that's how I learned a lot of this stuff, both in the court proceedings and in some of the rulings, and also in the work that McClurkin and Clifford and others were doing. So, what I was finding out, Mark, was that the United States was conducting cession treaty negotiations with tribes all over the United States, in
Yeah.
Tennessee and in Georgia and in Alabama. They were driving tribes off of their homelands,
Mm.
like in Florida, and they were pushing them over into long death marches over to Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. And a lot of our tribes in Wisconsin got pushed to Oklahoma, by the way.
Yeah.
And instead of pushing us to Oklahoma, they wanted to push us to western uh, Minnesota, right
Minnesota.
over there on the boundary of our enemies, the Dakota. So we didn't have very good prospects back in the 1830s. We were in
Wow.
trouble,
Yeah.
and so then now I can tell you a little bit about some of the treaties that took our lands up here
Yeah.
in northern um, Wisconsin. Do you want to go to a commercial?
No, you can take a break. I can just let people know that they're listening to WOJB 88.9 FM, and we are talking about Treaty Day, which is celebrated on the 25th. and there were some plans for some celebrations or recognitions. I know the LCO community is recognizing that today. Their offices are closed. Some of the other tribes, I think, was it Bad River or Mole? They're going to be closed on Wednesday, which is the official day of the recognition. So, tell us more about what January 25th has for us.
We were supposed to have a celebration of the formation, the founding of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, which was created just exactly 40 years ago.
Hmm.
And it's an organization that was born um, after the ruling, the January ruling of what came down to be known as the Voight or the Wisconsin versus Chippewa case. Way back then was a battle over the treaty rights of the Chippewa Indians of back then of northern Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And Le Coudray was the tribe that battled this all the way to the Supreme Court. And I tell you, I was a brand new councilman on the
Yeah.
elected to the tribal governing board back then in '75, and by accident, I found out that we were engaged in this horrendous uh, court case that was being argued out in the Madison courts. So what I did was I traveled down to Madison to sit in on some of the sessions and really got a fascinating education about treaty rights. And I I found, for example, that in Wisconsin, after all of these other session treaty encounters in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, now the U.S. government decided to take the timberlands of the Indians in this territory. Back then, it was the territory of Michigan, but eventually it would become Wisconsin.
Okay.
And it started in 1825 in Prairie Du Chien. Prairie Du Chien is a big village located on the Mississippi River where the Wisconsin River empties into the Mississippi.
Oh, okay.
And it's way down there on the
Yeah.
southwest corner of our state. And Prairie Du Chien was a vibrant uh, trading community back then, 1825. You had French and British trappers going in and out of there, and they were
Hmm.
pulling themselves up the Mississippi River from New Orleans, and they were bringing trade goods, and the Indians were pouring down from northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, Michigan, with tons of beaver pelts, and you had this vibrant industry happening, and there were other trade items that were being sold and traded as well.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened was a couple of agents from the United States came in and met with 13 tribes in Prairie du Chien in the hot summer of 1825. And they negotiated there for 13 days. And the trouble of negotiating with the tribes was the language barrier.
Sure.
You had Dakota Indians there, you had Ho Chunk, and you had Kickapoo and Potawatomi, and just a host of Algonquian tribes. You had the Menominee, and then all the Ojibways from northern Minnesota and Wisconsin.
Hmm.
And so all of these tribal people coming together, literally thousands of Indians, uh, bivouacking there on the island just out beyond this town, the village of Prairie du Chien. And language was the biggest problem.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been some paintings of those treaty negotiations. Of course, there weren't cameras back then,
Yeah.
but the paintings show literally hundreds and hundreds of tribal leaders meeting, assembled around these treaty negotiators acting on behalf of the United States government. And by the way, that was not a cession treaty, that was a setup treaty. That was a treaty in which the United States, they called that a treaty of peace and friendship. But really, it was a treaty to identify the boundaries of each of those 13 tribes.
Yeah.
And so what you had negotiators coming in and talking about ownership of land. And the tribes were stumped by this. They couldn't figure out what the argument was about because why would we have a boundary, between our
Yeah.
lands?
Right.
We cross each other's lands and we join each other. We're relatives and we hunt together and fish together and we don't need a boundary. And so you
Mhm.
had those kinds of arguments going
Yeah.
on. And of course, the treaty commissioners were really insistent that they get these boundaries.
Sure. Got about 3.5 minutes left.
Okay. I guess I should move on.
Yeah.
After the Treaty of Prairie Du Chien, there were over a dozen treaties in Wisconsin. Most of the lands that were taken were the mineral lands in southern uh, Wisconsin, and eventually in 1837, there was the Treaty of St. Peter's, the Pine Tree Treaty, that was negotiated over at Fort Snelling, and Le Coudray didn't show up. LCO never showed up in 1837. That was a 10-day negotiation. The interior tribes were not told about the treaty negotiation.
Hmm.
And one of the Indians did show up 5 days late, and his name was Pukwamu. And he was one of the headmen of LCO. So he represented LCO, um, and so LCO was virtually left out of this treaty negotiation. Nonetheless, this was a cession treaty in which the United States uh, wanted to take 9.5 million acres of land, and most of the lands that were taken belonged to the tribes, the interior tribes, who were known as Le Coudray, parts of Lac de Flambeau, St. Croix tribes, and
Yeah.
Mille Lacs.
Okay.
So that was the big one, and I should say in the negotiations, the tribes um, insisted on reserving the rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the territory that they were ceding. And that was the argument that led to the litigation in the 1970s in the battle over the hunting and fishing rights of the tribe.
Sure.
So that's how we lost our land and gained in in reserve these lands and the rights to hunt and fish and gather in the lands that we sold.
Yeah. So you're not bound by the borders, if you will, of the reservation. You are able to go and fish and hunt and gather in areas outside of that, and
Yeah,
that
outside of it on
includes,
public property.
yeah, that includes a lot of different lands, and I think people misunderstand that that is there and that is available, as it's been shown by tests and um, things that have happened on hunting and fishing. So, thank you, Rick, for coming in. I appreciate your information, your history. You are quite the knowledgeable guy. So, appreciate you coming in. All right. We're listening to WOJB 88.9 FM, listener supported community radio.